Now we are starting with Module 1. Module 1 is dedicated to an overview of conceptual and theoretical framework of land governance. Let me first explain some of the objectives and expected outcomes of this module. Through this module, we are trying to bring all participants to a minimum common level of understanding on land issues, including better knowledge about key terminologies. The module also aims at informing participants on the multifaceted dimension of land governance. It also aims at making participants aware of the nexus between land governance and development. Then the module will present key continental commitments highlighting the contribution of land policy in reaching set targets. Outline of the module. The module has the 5 following aspects. 1, multifaceted dimension of land. 2, need for an interdisciplinary approach of land issues. 3, the historical context, focusing on the colonial legacy. 4, the importance of land in development. And 5, continental and global commitments and land issues. So let me go straight to the first aspect, which is the multifaceted dimension of land. When you talk about land, you can comment from different perspectives. Mainly, you can comment from a narrow perspective or from a wide perspective on land. From a narrow perspective of land, land can be seen as the soil, meaning the emerged surface of the earth. This perspective of land is used by scientists in the field of soil sciences, which is mainly pedology. Pedology is the scientific discipline concerned with different aspects of soil. Those aspects include, first, pedogenesis, which relates to the origin, the study of the origin and process of soil formation. The morphology of soils, which study the physical properties of the soil. And soil classification, which is about the different categories of soils and their potential use. But we can look at land from a wider perspective. The wide perspective of land is the one which is brought to us mainly by economists. So I'll borrow a definition or a description of what land is from Dr. Marshall, which is a very famous economist. Land, according to Marshall, is not merely land in the strict sense of the word, but whole of the materials and forces which nature gives freely to man, aid in land, water, in air, and light and heat. So this is a definition by Marshall. Land meaning not merely land in the strict sense of the word, but the whole materials and forces which nature provides to man. From this wider perspective, land includes the oceans, the lakes, rivers, mineral deposits, rainfall, water power, fisheries, forests, and many other aspects that the nature is providing to us. You can look at this slide, which is a kind of global representation of land resources. You have the earth, you have the land as we know it, but we also have oceans. On the land, we have different other resources like forests that maybe we can see in green. We have lakes that we can see here. We have mineral resources that we cannot see here, and so on. So land from a global, from a wider perspective, is really including all natural resources. One thing important to remember is the territorial waters. Land is not only the land in the strict sense of the word within the national territory, it also includes part of the ocean. Part of the ocean which is adjacent to the coast and which is part of the territory of coastal countries. So in order to have territorial waters, you need to be a coastal country. And the territorial waters is subject to the sovereignty of the considered coastal country. So these slides represent the different aspects of the territorial waters. So if your country is a coastal country, you can look at the dark blue area and see what the territorial waters is representing for your country. There is no unanimous understanding of the territorial waters, but you have a convention which has been adopted in 1982, which is a law on the land sea, which considers that the territorial waters is a distance from the coast up to 22 kilometers. That is the common understanding of what territorial water is. But due to geopolitics, it can vary. Let me show you some facts about land. How old is land? Land is more than 4 billion years. So it's very old. Land, the planet is very old. The current population is reaching to something like quite 8 billion people. We can think of what is the land implication of such a situation. More people on the planet mean more pressure on natural resources, on land, on water, on forests, and others. The land area is about 29% of the Earth, meaning that the majority of the area are oceans. 70% of the Earth is oceans. One thing very important is to understand that fresh water, on which we are relying for our existence, is only 3%. We only have 3% water resources. The other part, 97%, is salt water that we cannot consume. So very important to keep this in mind. I'm showing you this slide to let you know that land also has a very important political dimension. Land is also national territories. You can see this map. The map represents national territories over which different governments have sovereignty. You see the different 55 AU member states. So land is not only about natural resource, it is also part, it also has a political dimension as it is about national territories. It is important to understand that Africa is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, continent in the world. Look at this map. On the left side, you have the usual map we can see with different countries. But on the right side, you can see that the United States, China, India, the EU, and other countries can fit within the size of Africa. This is to show you that Africa is really a big continent. But when you look at just a map, you can't realize how big it is. But I think that this map shows you that Africa is really a big continent. And this will have an implication in terms of land and land resources, meaning that the biggest continent might have also a lot of land resources, forest resources, minerals, and others. There is one important aspect that we need also to keep in mind in Africa. This is the principle of intangibility of African borders. This is enshrined in the Constitutive Act of the African Union. The Constitutive Act states that the Union shall function in accordance with the following principle. This is 4B of the Constitutive Act. Respect of borders is existing on achievement of independence. So this is also important to understand, meaning that land, we should look at it also in Africa from the perspective of borders. You know that the African Union even have a border program. And we all know that those borders have been inherited from the colonial period. So this is the first aspect that we have just looked at. Now we'll move toward discussing the need for an interdisciplinary approach of land. I would say that land is at the crossroad of so many disciplines. We can look at land from our different and respective disciplines. For economists, for example, land is perceived first and foremost as a factor of production and a commodity. So the question for economists would be, for example, how does land serve economic growth? How does land serve agricultural production, and so on? It can also include how can land be used for easy access to credit. So this is economic perspective. The questions behind are really specific. From a historical perspective, if you are a historian, you might be interested in looking at land from a dynamic perspective. Land tenure, in particular, is not a static aspect. It has been moving across years. You have in Africa customary land tenure, which was there before colonial intervention, and you have the intervention of the colonial powers, mainly in the 19th century, which influenced the way land is managed in our continent. Then you can also be interested in looking at what the post-independent African countries did with their land systems. From a legal perspective, lawyers look at land rights and also are interested in land conflicts resolution. How do you own land? How do you access land? This is typical questions of interest for lawyers. How can we secure land rights? Through which land administration systems? Lawyers are very interested in that. How do we manage land disputes and land conflicts? This is also a very important aspect of land for lawyers. Let me maybe end this diversity of perspective through the ethnology and anthropology concerns. Land, from the anthropological perspective, is mainly about the people. Land is part of African culture and African identity. You can see how this is quite different from a strict economic perspective. Land is not just an economic asset. Anthropologists consider that land is first and foremost a social relation. As I said, land is about the people. Land is relation amongst different people, different groups, and the land is just the support of social relations, social interaction. For anthropologists, alternative land dispute resolution mechanism is so critical, meaning that in most cases we know that the classic judiciary systems are not able to really manage land conflicts on the ground because they are not trusted enough. Well, I have a quote here from somebody called G. Ajete Kwasigan, who is an anthropologist of law. He's originating from Cote d'Ivoire. He passed away a long time ago. But I found his words so enlightening. Unfortunately, this is in French, but let me try. Le droit de propriété dans la conception négro-africaine ne peut venir que d'un travail créateur. How can I translate this for you? I would say that land property can result only from creative, from productive work. What is behind this is that you cannot own land because land is given by nature. You didn't produce the land. You didn't create the land. What you can own is what you have created. Land is given by nature. So this is the African conception of land. For those reading French, you can also go through the rest of this, the quote of this author. Very enlightening. Now, I want to insist that land is so complex that we need to address it through building a collective intelligence. That's what I call interdisciplinarity. You need to really be open to a diversity of disciplines if you want to fully understand the different and complexity, the different dimensions and complexity of land. I will start by the principle, which is that when you need to generate knowledge around a complex issue, you need to bring complementarity between different scientific disciplines, meaning that looking at land from one single discipline may result in missing critical dimensions of land, specifically in Africa. If you look at land only as an economic asset in Africa, you might lose the critical importance of land, which is the cultural and spiritual dimension of land. We might think that this is old conceptions, but this is the reality today. This interdisciplinarity and collective intelligence for understanding land has been addressed through different perspectives. First, pluridisciplinarity. Pluridisciplinarity is about teaching, using simultaneously different scientific disciplines, which usually are taught separately. Usually, such pluridisciplinary approaches are just a compilation of knowledge from different angles. But interdisciplinarity is the interaction between two or more scientific disciplines with a view to producing an integrated approach and original representation of land issues. From a specific discipline, the researcher will explore the potential value addition of other disciplines. This will result then in cross-fertilization of approaches and results. There are other approaches like transdisciplinarity, which is studying a theme through involving representatives of different scientific disciplines, meaning that you are trying to build a team which comprises different representatives from different disciplines. So really understanding land issues call for teams, working in teams for cross-fertilization of knowledge. Obviously, you cannot just think that you can be understanding economic history, geography, and others. Just try to be curious about those different disciplines and try to work with experts from different disciplines. That's the key really to understanding land. I think it's very important to give you some more information about the historical background of land policy. I really think that if you don't look at some of the historical background of the land policy in Africa, you won't understand what's going on in the continent. So the colonial legacy has been has influenced critically African land policies. One very important event is the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference took place in 1884, from November 1884 to February 1885. It was convened by Chancellor Bismarck, and the purpose was to establish key rules for colonization of Africa. One of the very important rules set for the colonization of Africa is the rule according to which there is need for effective occupation of a territory by a colonial power to form the basis for claiming the possession of this territory. So a colonial power cannot claim possession of a territory unless it has effectively occupied this territory. So after this rule has been set at the Berlin Conference, Africa experienced what was called the scramble for Africa. And the continent was shared between different colonial powers, including the British, the French, the German, the Belgian, the Portuguese, the Italians. And you can see that the most powerful colonial powers were mainly the British and the French. The Germans lost their colonial possessions. The Belgium didn't own that many possessions, and Italy came very late and was not able to conquest so important possessions. And Portugal also have few concessions in the continent. But most important is to understand that the biggest colonial powers, those who conquered the most territories, are the British and the French. By the end of 1900, the European states had claimed nearly 90% of African territory. So this slide shows the different French possessions at the beginning, just after the Berlin Conference. So you can see that the different colonial powers were established in different parts of the continent, but by 1900, they just completed the conquest, the territorial conquest of Africa. I want to go through a specific example, which is the legacy of the colonization in Africa, mainly in Francophone Africa, which is mainly West Africa, but also Central Africa and also part of Northern Africa. For the colonial power, traditional land systems were not reliable. They were considered as highly insecure because they are not based on written norms. They are not. They don't provide a land title to show evidence of ownership and so on. So, and also they are varying according to the region, according to the locations, to the village and others. So the colonial power just considered that traditional land system is a system they cannot build on. So they needed to create another system. They also found that the system that they had in their own country was not appropriate for colonial territories. So they decided to build a new system specifically for the colonies. Where did they get inspiration for their system? They imported, in fact, the system from Australia. This is what is called the Australian Torrens Act. The Australian Torrens Act is based on the principle that land ownership is created only by the state. You cannot just find a landowner in an African territory unless it has been created and recognized by the state. So the state will be the source of all property rights. In order to establish these property rights, a very complex, lengthy, and costly procedure was put in place. You can see that those procedures were not adapted for the local people, and as a result, it benefited mainly the urban elites and the colonial companies. The Torrens system considered that all non-registered land are what they call terre vacante et sans maître, meaning vacant and untitled lands. And therefore, those terre vacante et sans maître are systematically and automatically integrated in the state land domain. So this is one of the origins of the state sovereignty over land that we know in so many countries in Africa, mainly Francophone countries. Therefore, indigenous people rights are just considered as precarious use rights. You can use the land, but if the state needs these lands, it will be just taken out from you because you are not the owner according to the Torrens system. Only the state owns titled lands if they have been registered in the name of the state, and individuals might own private, might have private ownership of the land if they have titled their land, but any land which is not titled will just fall into the state land domain. There were few attempts to recognize customary-based land rights, which are the overwhelming situation for African people, but it didn't materialize. You have a decree in October 1925, which tried to organize a kind of land adjudication system on the ground, but this system was never implemented. And you have a second attempt with a decree in 1955, but it was never implemented either because the implementation regulations were never adopted. Now let me move to the importance of land in development. Why is land so important to African development? I would say that land is at the heart of all economic activities, wherever we are, in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America. Land is at the heart of all economic activities. First of all, land is obviously a factor of production in agriculture, including pastoralism. If you need to produce in agriculture, you need to access land and have security of tenure in land. If you are a pastoralist, you also need land because you need to move across different areas and access the natural resources, the water, the grazing lands, and so on. If we look at urban development, land is critical in shaping how cities function. Land is critical, for example, in shaping how the people will benefit affordable housing, will benefit basic infrastructure, public services, recreational areas, and so on. You can see that in many African countries, the weak management of land and governance of land results in creating so many slums. Land is very important in the tourism industry. The tourism industry requires access to land for creating parks, preserving wildlife, and others. So I could continue to mining, to forestry, and so on, and you can see how land is critical for all activities, economic activities, environmental activities, and others. Usually, we could consider that the prosperity of a country is linked to the richness of its land and natural resources. But in fact, it's not automatic. We already mentioned that Africa has a lot of land resources, but Africa is not benefiting these land resources, is not benefiting the prosperity from its land resources. The reason for that is land and natural resources are just a potential for development. So the challenge for Africa is how do we transform the potential into impact? Transforming the potential of land into impact will happen if we treat African people, specifically the young, talented generation, the women, as its greatest and most precious resource. What I want to say here is that you might have the land, but the most important factor for developing your land is the human resource, the people themselves. That's why I show you this book from Prahalad with a quote: if we stop thinking of the poor as a burden and start recognizing them as resilient and creative entrepreneurs and value-conscious consumers, a whole new world of opportunity will open up. I could translate this in Africa with our smallholder farmers. Let's not just consider the smallholder farmers as ignorant farmers, poor farmers. If we really stop considering them as a burden, and recognize their capacity, their resilience capacity, their capacity to be creative, well, we'll have an opportunity to really develop our lands. And I really like this new face of Africa. This is a picture of Faye Naima. Faye Naima is a girl from Niger, in Difa, Difa is a very far remote village in Niger, in the eastern part of Niger, and she just joined the NASA this year, a few months ago. So this is to show how the people constitute really the most important factor for developing our land resources. Maybe a few comments on those factors which influence productivity in land. We could think of natural factors like climate, the fertility of the land, the rainfall, and so on. We also have the human factor, which I consider is really the key factor. You might also consider the situation factor. If you have proximity to water resources, proximity to markets, it matters really. You can also consider the method of cultivation. You have extensive cultivation and you have intensive cultivation. The difference between the two is not really the size of the farm, it is the method of cultivation. Extensive cultivation is practiced in countries with abundant land resources. This type of cultivation uses as much land as possible. It will make little investment in the land, and it will use basic cultivation methods. It will heavily depend on rainfall, and it's not using fertilizers, and it results in very low yields. Intensive cultivation is practiced in countries with limited arable lands comparing to the population. It requires investment of large amount of capital in the land. It will use modern method like using tractors. It will use selected seeds. It uses a lot of technology. It uses irrigation, and it results in higher yields. But once again, most important factor is the human factor. I will go now to the last dimension of my presentation, which is about the continental and global commitments. The African leadership has adopted different commitments to sustainable development and poverty eradication. One of those commitment is the AU Agenda 2063, which articulates different aspirations. I can mention the NEPAD, which has long-term objectives, the NEPAD long-term objectives. I can also mention outside the continent, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. In order to achieve the goals and commitments of the African leadership, you necessarily need to take appropriate measures to ensure that land is playing its primary role in development. That means that you need to acknowledge the legitimacy of indigenous land rights. The majority of the people, the overwhelming majority of the people in our continent are accessing and using land through customary land systems. So if we talk about eradicating poverty, we need to make sure that they are accessing land and owning land in a very secure manner. We also have a need to address issues of tenure security in general and improving access to land through land reforms. Land reform is a critical measure which is of high importance to achieving the commitments of the African leadership, including the aspirations of African people as set in Agenda 2063. One important dimension is about strengthening the land rights of women. I could also add strengthening the land right of the youth. These are very dynamic actors who unfortunately have limited access and ownership over land. So changing this paradigm might lead to more possibility in achieving the Agenda 2063 aspirations. We also need to manage the use of land in other sectors. It's not only about agriculture, we need to manage the use of land in the urban sector, for manufacturing, for mining, for tourism, as we stated recently. Land governance is very important to consolidating democracy in Africa. Because land governance is not just about the technical stewardship of an asset. It's not just about laws, regulations, and procedures. Land governance has important bearing on democracy as it relates to issues which are highly political. For example, the devolution of power over land management. It calls for decentralization. The decentralization is a highly political dimension, and it has a bearing on democracy. Today, it's widely acknowledged that land policies are to be developed, implemented, and monitored in a participatory manner. This is also an important aspect of democracy. It's not just for a minister or technical agencies to sit and prepare everything on land. There is need for involving all key stakeholders in the process of land policy development, implementation, and monitoring. It is also important to prevent land capture by the domestic elites and also address the issue of land grabbing by foreign companies. This has a highly political dimension. Strengthening the land rights of women has also to do with democracy. It's not just an issue of marital situation. It's an issue of human rights. Redressing the historical injustices in some parts of the continent is highly important. It will even decide on the future of different nations across the continent, mainly nations in the southern part of our continent. All those objectives and orientations require fundamental reshaping of the decision-making process toward holistic approaches in land reform, toward aligning land policy with strategic development and environmental objectives. There is also need to facilitate effective participation of citizens in land reform processes, and also important to assert political will in support of proper land reform. Agenda 2063 was adopted by the African Union in January 2015. Agenda 2063 is Africa's indigenous plan for the transformation of the continent. It expresses the key aspiration of the African people based on the legacy of the Pan-Africanist leaders of the continent. It also is based on forward-looking toward the next the next 50 years. So the time frame is by 2063. That's why it's called Agenda 2063. The vision of the African Renaissance is an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the international arena. So an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens. Agenda 2063 is showing us the way toward the Africa we want. It articulates the desire of African people for themselves and for future generations. It is guided by the ideas of African Pan-Africanism and the vision of African Renaissance. It is putting Africa at the place it deserves in the international arena. Agenda 2063 is articulated around 7 key aspirations. Aspiration 1, a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. Aspiration 2, an integrated continent, politically united and based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism and the vision of African Renaissance. Aspiration 3, an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Aspiration 4, a peaceful and secure Africa. Aspiration 5, an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, shared values, and ethics. Aspiration 6, an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for children. And finally, aspiration 7, Africa as a strong, united, and influential global player and partner. The realization of all those 7 aspirations require improved governance of land and natural resources. You have again the 7 aspirations. So let me go through those aspirations and see what are the land implications. Aspiration 1, the content focus on prosperity, inclusive growth, sustainable development, So making land play its proper role in development is critical to reaching prosperity and inclusive growth and sustainable development. There is need to secure land rights for ease of access to credit. Aspiration 2 is about regional integration. The land dimension is about the need for experience sharing, mutual learning in land policy development, implementation, and monitoring. Cooperation and solidarity in negotiating fairer land deals is also a dimension of this aspiration 2. Aspiration 3 is about good governance, democracy, and human rights. Here, obviously, land governance is part of achieving this aspiration. Peace and security. Land governance has to do with this through the need for preventing and resolving land disputes and conflicts, which are at the core, roots of most conflicts. Cultural identity, heritage, and values. Land has to do with this, as in Africa, land has a very important cultural and spiritual dimension. Aspiration 6 is about the potential of African people, men and women. Building the human capacity for land policy development, implementation, and monitoring is so important to achieving this aspiration. Strengthening the land rights of women is also critical, as well as ensuring the participation of African women in decision-making processes. Making Africa an influential global player and partner. We can also consider that promoting the AU agenda on land in the international arena is important to implementing this aspiration. Let me comment aspiration 1, which is about the prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth. I don't want to go again through all the different aspects of this aspiration, but you can see that it is articulating the fact that African countries need to be among the best performers in global quality of life. Africa's collective GDP need to be proportionate to her share of the world population and others. And mainly, Africa's agriculture will be modern and productive, using science, technology, innovation, and others. So the modern and productive agriculture need to be based on secure land rights, secure access to credit, and for increased environment in increased investment in the land sector. Aspiration 2, an integrated continent, politically united. Putting in place the infrastructure across the continent, roads, highways, railways, boosting the local and national development has important implications in land use. The local population, which might be displaced while developing this infrastructure, need to be adequately compensated for the loss of their land rights. Aspiration 3, good governance. Again, this aspiration need to be articulated with the need for improved land governance. And it's also important to understand that land governance depends on the overall governance in a specific country. A peaceful and secure Africa. Again, I don't want to go through each of the content of the aspiration. I want to just highlight the implication, the land implication. Here, the land implication is that land conflict prevention and settlement are critical as the root cause of most disputes and regional conflicts. So it's really important to establish mechanisms for preventing and managing land conflicts. Aspiration 5, an Africa with cultural identity. Again here, land in Africa is not just an economic asset. It is deeply embedded in cultural, religious inspiration and spiritual perceptions. So this is important to take into consideration. Aspiration 6, Africa whose development is people-driven. Strengthening the human resource in land management and governance is key to successful land policy development and implementation. Strengthening the land rights of African women and African youth is also critical to ensuring the development in the continent. And finally, aspiration 7. Africa has a strong, united, and influential global partner. Here, the land implication is that Africa will take the leadership of its own land policy development agenda. It will also promote solidarity and cooperation in the field of large-scale land-based investment negotiations. Let me now quickly go through the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals was adopted also in 2015. Its time frame is 2030, and it's a commitment of the world leadership, meaning that also African leadership has committed to the SDGs. The SDGs is a universal call for action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure peace and prosperity for all by 2030. The SDGs has 17 interrelated goals, and it is a commitment to fast-track progress due to the challenges that the world is facing today. It calls also for partnerships. All stakeholders, including member states, CSOs, local authorities, private sectors, and others, are called to participate in the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see here the 17 goals. Poverty reduction, zero hunger. So I can let you go through all those goals, the 17 goals. Please look at them. You can see that some are really directly related to land issues. For example, when you call for no poverty, obviously you need to really consider the land aspect. Gender equality, let's think of how we can build gender equality in the field of land, etc. Now you can see the link between the AU Agenda 63 goals and the SDGs. I will not go into too many and lengthy comments on the interlinkages, but what I want to show you here is that you will find how the AU agenda goals are related to the UN Sustainable Development Goal. For example, AU Agenda Goal 1 is about high standard of living, and you can find an equivalent or a relation with the goals of the SDGs related to ending poverty, ending hunger, promoting sustainable, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, and others. So what I want you to take here is that, well, the AU agenda is strongly interrelated to the SDGs. It's not competing with the SDGs, and it's calling for cooperation between the two. So let me just show you where I found that there is not a direct relationship. For example, when you take the goal 8 of AU agenda, it's about United Africa, federal or confederal Africa. There's no specific link to the SDG there. Considering the establishment of a financial and monetary institution, there's no direct relationship. So there is really very limited areas where you will not find a relationship. So this is really what I wanted you to see. You have the AU agenda, but the AU agenda has to be considered in relationship with the SDGs. So this is what I wanted to tell you. I can consider that our journey toward the Africa we want has started now. So keep safe for this journey. Wash hands, put your mask, and keep social distance for a successful journey toward the Africa we want. Thank you so much.